This week we're talking about chapter 12, the Age of Reform. And before we start talking about the actual content of what's in the chapter, I want to step back and look at how Foner is structuring his argument, right? His overall argument with this textbook, and how he lays out his chapters, right? So going back to chapter 9, he laid the foundation, the economic foundation of the market revolution, right? Because he wants us to understand the economic transformations that are happening during this era, this period between 1815 with the end of the War of 1812 and roughly around 1840 before the war with Mexico, before westward expansion takes over. And then in chapter 10, he looks at the political transformations of the era. So we start with economics, then we work into the politics, and then he gets to chapter 11 with the peculiar institution, with slavery, the institution that's kind of at the heart of both the economic and the political transformations. It's the central defining feature of American life that's eventually splitting the South from the North. And now here in chapter 12, he's going to step back and look at how individual groups and how individuals and groups of individuals reacted to all these changes. There's so much happening in America at this time, and people responded in many ways. So here he's going to tell us about the reformers. You know, a lot of people who thought America was going to hell in a handbasket, and we had to save ourselves and save our society. And so he's going to tell us about the Shakers and the Utopians and the temperance folks who are trying to ban alcohol, and these are folks who fear that the market revolution is challenging these values that they hold dear, and that certain values of the marketplace are trumping natural values and spiritual unity and group cohesion. And so he's going to tell us about how people respond to those changes. And so as you're reading the chapter, you got to think about these people in the context of what you've already read about the economic transformation, the industrialization, the improvements in transportation, the beginnings of westward expansion, and also the political transformations, the removal of property restrictions on voting, the rise of democracy, at least for white men. This is the context. He's laid the context, and now he wants to show us how people are responding to this. And of course, the biggest one, the one I want to talk a little bit more about, the biggest reform movement is the abolitionist movement. I take that back. It's actually not the biggest one necessarily, but it has the most profound impact. In fact, part of what I want to emphasize is that the people who called themselves abolitionists were actually a very, very small minority, even of Northerners, and certainly in the context overall of America. It's a very, very small minority of white Americans who call themselves abolitionists and who believe in abolitionism, certainly as Garrison, William Lloyd Garrison would frame it. Because abolitionism was tremendously radical. You know, looking back from the 21st century, we're all abolitionists now, right? We all think slavery was evil. We all think it was terrible to have this kind of stain on our national honor, and that it was a great thing for slavery to be abolished and for slaves to be emancipated. But we got to go back into the mindset of the early 19th century, and we have to think about how radical it would seem for people, especially white people, to advocate for the immediate abolition of slavery. Again, slavery was this powerful and very profitable economic institution, right? Especially in the South, the whole way of life was built upon slavery, and so to challenge that was exceedingly radical and dangerous. And so as abolitionism starts to form as a movement in the 1830s, the white South is very, very worried. Stepping back a bit to talk about kind of the origins of abolitionism. Of course, many black folks, slaves and escaped slaves and free blacks, had long been advocates of abolition. Very few people advocate for their own enslavement, right? So blacks had been pushing for an end to slavery for a long time, and there was an international movement to to end slavery, particularly in Britain. It really gained steam in the early 1800s. In this country, it was much slower to take root, in part because the Southern culture, Southern politicians were very powerful, certainly in Washington, and because slavery was so profitable. But with the publication of David Walker's appeal in 1827, 1829, what you get is the first articulation of what becomes known as immediatism, where people are advocating for the immediate end to slavery. And this is going to be a sharp contrast with colonization. We've talked about colonization a bit in class here and there, and this kind of marked the enlightened white man's response to the Negro problem. It's like, guys like George Washington and others would say, well, yes, we should emancipate our slaves, but we all know that they can't be equal citizens in America. So the solution is to then colonize them, send them elsewhere. And in 1816, 17, you get the creation of the American Colonization Society, which is a philanthropic group designed to raise money to send slaves back to Africa, freed slaves back to Africa, and compensate the slave owners. And you get all kinds of prominent Americans. Francis Scott Key, the author of the Star Spangled Banner, is one of the founders of this organization, and it becomes widely popular, widely embraced among elite leadership. This was kind of understood that this was the way to deal with the Negro problem. Abraham Lincoln becomes perhaps the most prominent colonizationist, all the way through until he issues the Emancipation Proclamation. So abolitionists directly reject colonization, and that in itself is tremendously radical and marks them as challengers of the reigning orthodoxies, or the elite opinion on black people in this country, because they're saying, look, slavery is just wrong, period. It's a moral wrong. We need to eradicate this moral wrong. We need to wipe the stain off our national honor. We need to eliminate slavery immediately. And the person who becomes most closely associated with this idea of immediate abolition, as opposed to gradual abolition followed by emancipation, is William Lloyd Garrison. And when he starts out, William Lloyd Garrison's really, to me, an extraordinary figure, because he's this small, frail, kind of sickly guy, bald, bespectacled. He doesn't look like the devil that Southerners thought him to be. He certainly doesn't look intimidating in any way. But through the power of the press, he becomes this leading advocate for abolitionism, and tremendously powerful and widely feared. His newspaper, The Liberator, which he starts publishing in Boston in 1831, he originally wants to do it in Washington, D.C., the nation's capital. It's a slave city. He wants to go kind of into the citadel itself and break down slavery from within. But it's too dangerous, and so he goes to Boston and starts publishing in 1831, and it quickly becomes a sensation. And white people in the South just detest this thing. I mean, they ban it. I mean, it's basically banned everywhere south of the Mason-Dixon line. You get people who are arrested on charges of bringing it into their territory, even into Washington, D.C. You're not supposed to have this radical literature. I mean, it was sort of akin to someone distributing Al-Qaeda literature today. You'd look at them and say, what are you? You're some crazed terrorist. What's the matter with you? Why are you trying to destroy our society? And Garrison, he starts out, he's just in his mid-20s when he launches this paper, and he dedicates the rest of his life, the next 4 decades, to advancing this cause of abolition. And he's remarkably successful, and remarkably controversial and widely reviled, even within the abolitionist movement, as we'll get to in a minute. But his line is, people say, well, why are you so aggressive? Why are you so vociferous about this? And he said, I'm all on fire because I have mountains of ice about me to melt. In fact, that's one of his great biographies is called All on Fire. I'm all on fire because I have mountains of ice about me to melt. Like, I can't help but be this way because look at the evil of slavery that I'm trying to fight. Look at the power of the slaveholders that I'm fighting. How can I not be all on fire? How can I not be as aggressive as I possibly can be? And he had no holds barred in the Liberator. I mean, they would send reporters down south and report back on conditions that slaves faced. And they would talk about the abolitionist movement in England and elsewhere. They would talk about the power that slaveholders had on Congress. And this really becomes the vehicle by which he builds a movement. It's a movement that eventually splits up into two wings, and it's interesting, isn't it? Somewhat ironic. It splits up over the issue of women. By 1840, what you get is a lot of the early people who come to the abolitionist movement are women who are angered by the existence of slavery, who are seeking ways to have an impact on society, right? They're denied access to politics and government. So this is a way that they can express their moral values in the public sphere. And you get a lot of prominent women. The Grimke sisters are among the most famous. You read their document later. And by 1840, some of the more conservative members of the abolitionist movement are saying, well, wait, this is getting a little bit out of hand. We want to just focus on abolitionism. And so they wind up splitting with the Garrisonians. And, Garrison says, look, women deserve every right that men do, just like blacks deserve every right that whites do. And so I want to emphasize that abolitionists really were radical. I mean, they challenged the fundamental premises on which American society was based. And a lot of people who became anti-slavery, were not necessarily abolitionists. Men like Abraham Lincoln, who believed that slavery was a problem for the country, that it was crippling us, that it was causing sectional divisions, and wanted to end slavery, but didn't have the same moral passion as that abolitionists have. It's easy for us, again, from the 21st century to say, oh, sure, I would be an abolitionist if I were alive in the mid-1800s. But it was a very, very small group. And it's interesting, too, to think about how abolitionists have been viewed by historians over the years. When the Civil War ends, the depiction of abolitionists was very negative. They were seen as zealots, as fanatics who created this war, this really destructive war. And that perception lasts for decades and decades. It's not really until the mid-20th century, with the beginnings of the modern civil rights movement, that people went back and reassessed abolitionists and said, well, wait a minute, maybe they were onto something. Maybe these were not zealots, and uncompromising fanatics, but they were actually noble visionaries. They were people who admirably fought to make America live up to its professed values. So during the mid-20th century, abolitionists were transformed into these noble figures, and people sympathized with them and sort of saw themselves in the abolitionists. By the late 20th century, of course, then there's kind of the pendulum swings back. There's kind of a cynicism that sets in. People look at the racism of the abolitionists, and Fodor talks about that. They couldn't extricate themselves from the racism of their time, and there was a lot of patronization of black people, certainly within the abolitionist movement. But by and large, by the 21st century, we're kind of coming back to saying these were really remarkable people who did an extraordinary thing for this country, and certainly that's where I stand. I mean, yes, they exhibited some of the racism of their time, but what is remarkable is how much they stepped out of that and how they advocated for this truly radical doctrine, not only of emancipation but of black citizenship. And after the war, former abolitionists become radical Republicans who push for black men to get the right to vote and who push for equal rights for black people. It was a remarkable social movement. So what I want you to do for your question today is to describe what made the abolitionists so radical to Americans in the mid-19th century, And what social movement today do you think most resembles the abolitionist movement, and why? I'll see you in class.